Well, welcome, and thanks for cramming yourselves into this room. I'm so happy to see so many people concerned about this topic, and I hope that our discussion today will be beneficial for all of us, for our students, for our families, and that we'll continue this important discussion. My name is Sara Osborne, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm an adjunct instructor at the college. I'm a sometimes homeschooling mom. I classically homeschooled my daughters for a couple of years in the lower grades, and then just last semester had the opportunity to put the whole family through that again. We were traveling overseas, and I kept the schooling going with my oldest three children. Those three children are students here at School of the Ozarks. I have an 8th grader, a 6th grader, a 2nd grader, and a preschooler who's on the fringes this year. He wants to be a 2nd grader, but he's not yet. One of those children is the catalyst for my concern about, care for, interest in, and research about this topic. This isn't going to be an exhaustive talk on special needs in the classical school. We could spend the entire conference and probably the better part of the weekend, if not the rest of our school year, talking about all the issues surrounding this topic and the resources and ideas that many of us have to offer. But I do know that it's a situation that can be frustrating for teachers, for parents, for children. And I'd like to start off by reading an excerpt from an article that talks about this kind of frustrating situation. On July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s single-engine Piper Saratoga crashed into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, killing John, 38, his wife Carolyn, 33, and Carolyn's sister Lauren. All investigations into the cause of the crash point to a phenomenon called spatial disorientation. Spatial disorientation occurs when a pilot flies into darkness or weather conditions that prevent him from being able to see the horizon or the ground. Points of reference that normally guide his senses disappear. His sensory perceptions become unreliable. He no longer knows which way is up or down. The danger of such disorientation is obvious. That's why most planes are equipped with navigational instruments designed to inform pilots of the plane's attitude, altitude, and ground speed. If a pilot enters into dark or cloudy conditions where his natural orientation senses become unreliable, he can, quote, fly by the instruments. Learning to place more confidence in a plane's instruments than one's own intuitive senses, however, requires training. When our mind senses potential danger, especially mortal danger, and urgently commands, bank right, while everything in us while the instruments say bank left, it is very difficult to trust the instruments. As one expert stated, reflecting on the Kennedy crash, you have to be well trained to disregard what your brain is saying and fly by the instruments. John had not received this training. He was certified to fly in conditions where he could visually distinguish the ground from the sky. However, en route to Martha's Vineyard, he flew into a hazy fog at night, experienced spatial disorientation, and trusted his perceptions to guide him. 3 days later, the Coast Guard located the remains of the plane and its young passengers on the floor of the Atlantic. I read you this excerpt. You might be wondering why we're talking about John F. Kennedy Jr. In a workshop on addressing special needs in the classical school, but I hope you hear the parallels there. I imagine that most of you don't have to think real hard about what the parallels are. When we encounter these types of learning challenges in the school or at home, it's disorienting. We think we know how to learn and how to teach, and then all of a sudden we know nothing about how to learn and how to teach. It's frustrating, it's disorienting, but there are some instruments that are reliable that can help guide us in this process. So I want to spend today talking about some challenges that we face in the classical school in educating children with special needs, and then some actual tools, resources that we can use to engage those challenges. But before we jump straight into the challenges and then the resources, I think it's important to spend just a few minutes, and I will try to just spend a few minutes, although as some of you know who have been to the other workshops in the past, I could spend a lot of time talking about why the philosophy of classical education necessitates our care for students with special needs. But I do think it's important to just briefly remember why we're having this discussion. So first of all, get my PowerPoint going here. Okay, so to ground this discussion, first of all, we need to think about the philosophy of classical Christian education and what it means to educate a student. Cheryl Swope is one of my favorite writers, authors, speakers on special needs in the classical school, and she talks largely in her book, Simply Classical, which if you only pick up one resource from this workshop, I hope you will all leave and go read this in its entirety. But she talks about how education is formative. I'd like to read you a quote from an article I wrote in Reflecting on Simply Classical for the Classical Thistle. Education is formative. That is, as educators, we are fundamentally about the formation of a human being who is valuable because he's made in the image of God. Cheryl Swope writes, the formative nature of classical education distinguishes it from much of education today. No matter the skill to be taught in classical education, the formation of the child's mind and character transcends the skill. So, children with special needs are often labeled as less valuable by the world at large because our culture measures value by skill production. Our view of both God and man necessitates an altogether different perspective. If we believe this to be true, we must seek to make classical education a formative education available to all students. For more on that, you can read the rest of the article on the Classical Thistle. Also, in addition to the formative nature of classical education, we must be careful that we don't equate classical education with academic rigor. The two are not synonymous. You can see Cheryl Swope's book. She has an excellent section on this in her book on academic rigor, but I'll quote one section for now. Some in the modern resurgence of classical education emphasize rigorous academic study, and certainly academic rigor assists in learning. Perseverance inclines the mind toward disciplined achievement. Even so, classical education must not be defined by relentless daily schedule of subjects a child can study precociously. If we overemphasize rigor, we risk failing to nurture the love of learning so essential for continued classical pursuits. Furthermore, we exclude those students for whom individual challenges preclude consistently rigorous performance. When we remember the formative elements of classical education, we will be free to cultivate excellence in a manner that promotes the joy of study. Now, I will just say as a disclaimer, I teach college composition at the college. Anyone who knows me knows that I believe in academic rigor. So this is not an excuse to not hold students to a high standard. It's simply a reminder that to be classical does not mean hours of homework and a certain level of academic rigor. The two are not synonymous. That's not what it means to be classical. Also, I just want to mention as part of grounding this discussion that sometimes the perception can be that we are spending all of our time and attention and conversation trying to help these students. We just can't do it. We just can't give them all that they need. Well, I would also like to say that children with special needs don't simply need the school community. The school community needs them. There's also more on that in the article on Classical Thistle. I'm telling you, we could have a whole slew of workshops on these rabbit trails. But I do think it's important to consider as we continue this discussion that this is not just how do we feed the needs that these students have in our schools, but how is our entire school community growing through figuring out how to address these problems? What does it contribute not just to the students who have the learning challenges, but to their peers and even their teachers and parents as well? So, now that we have that out of the way, let's move on to some of the challenges. I think there are 4 perceived obstacles to overcome. I'm sure there could be more than 4, but these are the 4 big ones that I hear the most often surrounding this discussion. Personnel resources in the classical school, curriculum resources, the extra time that it takes either to create, modify, come up with plans, or to actually implement those plans. And then parent buy-in and motivation, because as I'm sure all of you know, the teacher cannot do it alone. So first, let's talk about, moving forward, extra time. We're going to address those 4 challenges by talking about some strategies that work. And I chose that title intentionally. They do work. I can tell you my own success stories. I can tell you Cheryl Swope's success stories. We're not talking about theoretical approaches that might or might not have any impact on your students. These are strategies that can and have worked. So we're going to talk about the people, parents and teachers in partnership, the materials, curricula that work, the time, how to shuffle the schedule, and then the home team supporting the parents. So we'll get started with the people, parents and teachers in partnership. So the challenge when it comes to the people, the personnel, and I'm sorry I'm having to stand in front of you. Classical schools don't have special education personnel, aides for use during classroom instruction, and or teachers with specific training in meeting certain learning needs. This is what I hear when we think about we don't have the people, right? We're all familiar with this challenge. I'd like to talk about some potential solutions for this. First, teacher as detective. I'm going to talk about a few roles that the teacher can have, but one of the most important ones is teacher as detective. And what I mean by this is for teachers to be asking the question, what problems do I see in the classroom? Or with a specific student, what problems do I see with this student? You don't need any special training to observe problems. All you need is an observant set of eyes, an engaged mind, a caring heart, and maybe a pen and a piece of paper. Note down the symptoms that you see. You can think about when you go to visit the doctor, and it's not the nurse who takes your body weight and blood pressure that fixes the problem, right? But they're on the front lines making the doctor's work easier. So as a detective, what are you seeing in the classroom? What tests or specialists do you think could help in figuring out how to solve this problem? So simply being observant, the teacher as detective, is a really important role as far as the people to meet these needs. Oops, sorry, I'm not going. The second one is teacher as designer. What creative ways could you build and test knowledge in your classroom? Okay, there's a role for creativity here, right? Teacher as creator and designer. What could you come up with on your own that's not already in a book or a set of curricula that would help you in your classroom? And if you want to talk more about creativity, you can come hear Kyle and I talk about it tomorrow afternoon. The next one is teacher as resource. What books or materials could you recommend to parents? I'll give you some of these later so you can write them down and have them in your tool belt. What resources can you suggest to parents? Tutors, programs, creative suggestions that you come up with on your own. What can you recommend? You don't have to do it yourself, but what can you be a resource to provide for parents and families? So these are the roles that the teacher can play. The next one is parent as teacher. What can parents actively address during pull-out sessions at school, after schooling, summer schooling, in some cases homeschooling? What can the parent do? How can they help bridge the gap with what needs to happen with the struggling student? And then finally, tutors and helpers. Are there other people in your school's community who would be willing to take an active role in helping struggling learners? These could be empty nesters or grandparents of students at your school who would volunteer during school hours. Sometimes these are the most patient people because they've been through all the parenting already. Are there older students that can help younger students? Are there after-school or pull-out tutors that could be hired by either the school or the parent, the family? Certainly we can use outside helpers. It doesn't have to be a full-time employee to be an outside helper. So these are some of the people. Next, let's talk about the materials, curricula that work. The challenge with this is even if we do want to help struggling learners, I wouldn't know how to modify curricula or find appropriate resources that align with my school's classical model. This is a challenge that I hear a lot. I don't know, I'm not a special ed instructor, I don't have any training in this, I don't know how to modify what we use, and if I do that, is it still going to be classical? Am I going to get in trouble because I'm not following in the same vein as what the rest of the students are doing? And I want to offer you some suggested resources to help with this challenge today. This is the point where I have to say that this is not exhaustive. I'm just going to spotlight a few things that I know work. Some of these are geared more towards grammar stage students. However, a lot of them can be used with most any level and age of student. The first one has to do with struggling readers. This is a problem that occurs throughout all of our schools, I'm sure. Students tend to kind of pop up in their learning reading at different times and different ages and different grades. It doesn't all happen at the same time. Lower school teachers will know this to be true. But then there are those certain students for whom it just isn't clicking with what you're doing in the classroom. There are kind of a couple of veins of thought when it comes to teaching reading in the classical school. Most of us are probably using a phonics-based curriculum. And you might be wondering what you could do to help struggling readers that lines up with your school's classical approach to teaching reading. Reading programs that are based on the Orton-Gillingham approach work very well with the classical model. They are phonics-based. There's a variety of them to choose from. There are two that I know of that are currently in use at our school. We have students who use the Barton method. This is a tutor-led program. You do have to pay a trained tutor to do it unless your school chooses to make up that financial burden. It is very systematic, explicit. It doesn't leave gaps for students who cannot intuit those on their own. And so it walks them step by step, and they don't keep going until they've mastered a concept, which is really important for those struggling students who get lost because they're just moving from grade to grade and they're lost and you don't know how to make that up as a teacher. So that's one example program. Another one is called All About Reading. I use this program with my son. I chose it over Barton for a few reasons. One, I didn't have to pay somebody else to do it. I could do it myself. Two, I love how engaging and motivating it is for him. And third, I chose it because I felt like it absolutely complemented what was happening in classroom instruction in our school. I'll just show you quickly. We use a set of phonogram cards that we review every time I work with him. We have word cards that we master and review. All the phonogram cards are the same concepts as what the classroom teachers are teaching at our school with the Johnny Can Spell phonogram cards. We use repetitive practice, but it's fun. Just a couple weeks ago, we were doing a lesson on WH words, and we got to feed the whale after we read the word on the back of each fish. And it was fun. If you're going to do this as a teacher or as a parent, you won't make it if it's not engaging. It's hard work, hard work. You have to find ways for it to be motivating. And for our situation, I found that All About Reading really complements my son's learning style, and it helped me have the tools I needed to teach. Also, I would encourage you as a side note to evaluate classical curricula that may be in use to teach reading in your schools. Just because it has a classical publisher stamped on the back does not mean it's a good quality program or good quality readers or materials that go together well. So this past summer, some of you may have been at ACCS. I heard Laura Tucker talk about struggling readers. And she mentioned 4 words that have stuck with me that have kind of been my benchmark for how to measure curricula that I choose. And that is explicit, systematic, incremental, and simple. I'll say that again so you can write it down. Yeah. Explicit, systematic, incremental, and simple. If you can check the boxes for all 4 of those things, you're probably on your way to helping your struggling learner. These things are really important. The Barton method would do this, All About Reading would do this, and I'm sure there are other programs that I'm just not personally familiar with that would do this. Another resource that our family has used and has grown in popularity recently is the Simply Classical curricula that Memoria Press is putting out. This is a set of curricula designed specifically for children with special needs, anything from mild to severe, which I recognize to get your mind around how you even do that is kind of baffling. But if you go with me, here are some of the characteristics of it. It's visually uncluttered and so not overwhelming. There are explicit instructions. There's simpler and less text oftentimes. So for example, copywork, right here. The copybook, you have very short Bible verses, but it allows you the time as the parent, the teacher, the tutor to really focus on the handwriting and not be overwhelmed by, oh my goodness, we have 30 minutes and you've got this paragraph to copy. How do I help this child? They're still doing the same thing, just with less text. Another example is the writing curriculum. We used this last semester. I found it to be very explicit. Every time we do the same things, we circle the capital letter at the beginning of the word, we find the end mark, we look for proper nouns, we circle things, the same thing, we do it every week the same way. The child always knows what to expect. They're learning those important writing skills. The reason I have these particular samples here are because they're ones that I know and I've used. But the grade progression is growing with Simply Classical. It's more than just first and second grade curricula, so please don't be deceived by the samples that I have here if you're teaching older students. One of those helps for older students is their Latin, Simply Classical Latin. And if you could pull up the video back there, we couldn't get it to work in the PowerPoint, so we're going to switch over real quick. And I just want you to hear Cheryl Swope herself talk about using the Simply Classical Latin.
My name is Cheryl Swope. I have a master's degree in special education with an emphasis in the areas of learning disabilities and behavior disorders. But my real education came when we adopted twins, a boy and a girl, who came to us at age 14 months. They were both developmentally delayed. They were not yet sitting up well, and they were not yet walking. We did not know what the future held for them, but we embraced these children wholeheartedly. I wanted to give them literature and art and poetry and music and the Christian faith. I wanted to teach them everything, mathematics and science. I didn't know if it could be done with children with special needs. That whole story is told in Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child, after the book was published and was received with such a warm response. The curriculum director at Memoria Press asked if we could produce a Simply Classical curriculum for families whose children have special needs, like my own children. So we said yes, we can in fact create a curriculum. I had kept all of the notes that I had written back when I was teaching my own children, and flash forward from those babies who were adopted. We did homeschool them all the way through high school with a classical Christian education. They are now thriving young adults. My son loves history and theology, reads literature in his free time, and composes music. We taught him the piano, music theory with his mathematics. He loves science. He just loves to learn, and we're thrilled with that outcome. He also loves to serve in our church. He is the usher and...
Can we pause that for just a second? I think we have the wrong one pulled up. Can you go back and make sure it's the one on Latin? This is also an excellent video to watch about the whole overview, but I just wanted to show Simply Classical Latin.
Progression for special needs.
Yes, try that one. Okay, my apologies. Yes, thank you.
A study published in the Annals of Dyslexia found that students with learning disabilities fared far better with a phonological orthographic approach to studying Latin or any foreign language than they do with an immersion or whole language approach. Yet another study found that the best approach is with smaller, shorter lessons, multi-sensory or multimodal instruction, and explicit teaching with the student both reading and writing the words as they learn them. With all of this research in mind, we are delighted to present the Simply Classical Latin program. The Simply Classical Latin programs are Memoria Press Latin programs with different Latin plans to adapt for the child with special needs. We teach with shorter lessons, we have the multi-sensory instruction, such as games, and we provide more review. We begin a little bit later in our Simply Classical program. We want our students with special needs to have strong phonics and to be good readers before we ever begin Latin. So we do delay just a little bit to make sure that the reading foundation is there. We begin with Prima Latina, which teaches English grammar, nouns and verbs, along with Latin, but only 5 words at a time. We move then to Latina Christiana, which we begin in level 5, and we continue all the way through in a progression from 5 and 6, 7, and 8. For some of our students, they will spend 4 years in Latina Christiana, but we would prefer that they have some Latin rather than no Latin. From there, we move to First Form Latin, which begins for us in levels 9 and 10 and continue through 11 and 12. The Simply Classical Latin progression sees the student with special needs all the way through First Form Latin. We designed our Simply Classical Latin program not only to teach our students with special needs Latin, but also and primarily to improve their proficiency in English with reading, writing, spelling, and vocabulary. For help or support, visit our Simply Classical forum at simplyclassical.com.
Thank you. So I love I love just hearing from her about how that works. I'm not a Latin teacher, but I can foresee that on our horizon, thinking, how in the world are we going to tackle that? And I think this is an excellent aid for those of you who are trying to do that with your students or children. I just want to mention a few other resources from Simply Classical. They have an excellent line of books geared at social skills for very young children. Not all of learning challenges that you see in your classrooms are explicitly academic in nature. Some of them are behavioral, social, emotional, sensory issues, all kinds of issues that do complicate a child's learning but may not be solved with a set of different Latin books, for example. So it's called Me, Myself, and Others. I think it would be an excellent idea for all of our schools to have a little library of those books that you could hand parents or teachers to use with their children. Also, Simply Classical is far more than just a curriculum. You have the book by Sara Osborne here. They also put out a journal regularly. I have lots of copies here. Memoria Press told me you can have as many as you want. They have more over in the hook later if you don't get one today. Yes, this is a Memoria Press publication. Yes, they are trying to sell their books, but there are always encouraging articles in here. If you are a teacher trying to help struggling students, if you have parents of struggling students in your class that need to be encouraged, this is an excellent resource to put in their hands, if for no other reason than to let them know they're not alone. Also, there is a Simply Classical forum online. My mind was blown the first time I posted on there, and Cheryl herself responded within 24 hours with this detailed bullet point list of all the things I needed to do. It is an amazing resource. God has gifted the classical community with Cheryl Swope, and there are many other moms and teachers on that forum who are far more experienced in all of this than I am and can give lots of good advice. Also, Memoria Press has a conference in Louisville every year. They have added a Simply Classical track to that, where you can actually go to lots of workshops on how to use their resources and implement that in your classroom. If that's something that interests you, jump on board with that group. I'm sure they would be happy to see any of us there. I could spend another hour talking about books, games, apps, all kinds of resources, tools that have great value in helping struggling learners. But my main goal here in our time was to address the curricula issue, because a lot of times it's a teacher saying, yes, but we use this. What do I use with this student? What can I do that's different? These are, well, I won't jump ahead. Let's go to the time. Am I moving here? Okay, so the next challenge is, okay, I have these resources, I have these people, but what about all that time? None of us have any extra time to do anything more than we're doing right now. So where does it fit? The challenge, when will I, either teacher or parent, find time for different instruction, and how will I find the time to plan? Two big questions about time. Potential solutions, one related to time for instruction and one related to time for planning. As far as instruction goes, there are several options that we can offer students. We can have pull-out sessions during school time. There's no reason why a child who isn't following well in a certain subject can't be pulled out for that subject and have those needs addressed during that time at school to save the extra homework and after-school work later on, particularly with reading and skills like that that affect so many other aspects of their day in the classroom. It's wise to address those heartily with as much time as possible. Also, after-schooling and summer schooling. What can parents do at home after school, or teachers or tutors after school? But I will offer a word of caution there. Oftentimes these struggling learners are the same ones who are exhausted at the end of a school day. So do you need to give them less homework in a certain other area so that their parent can work with them in a certain subject area after school? Don't be afraid to make that exchange. It's a worthy investment. Also, summers. We have 3 whole months in the summer. I started All About Reading at the end of last school year with my son. That's not for us, right? Okay. I'm like, no! Way too early. Where was I? Summer schooling, yes. So I started at ground zero. Things just weren't working with him, and I said, you know what? We're just going to start over. We're going to start in May, and we're just going to keep going. And that's what we did. And we finished level 1. We are halfway through level 2. You just keep going. Summers are so useful. Some of our students need to be working in the summer so they don't forget skills that they are gaining in your classrooms. Others need to use that time to make up skills that they didn't catch from the grade they just completed before they're ready to go on. But just because they aren't ready in May doesn't mean they can't be ready by August. So utilize the summer. Also, larger chunks of time when personnel is available. A half day, a full day, several days a week. Cheryl even told me about a classical school near Tulsa that has a simply classical classroom. The students go there every day, 5 days a week. There's nothing stopping us from doing that in our schools. We're free. We don't have, government restrictions on the kinds of programs that we can run. So we are free to be creative with some of these strategies with time. But time for instruction is not the only time hurdle. We also have time for planning. However, resources like All About Reading or Simply Classical, many of them were written for homeschooling families. So they are basically teach and go. They are ready for you. They are not going to require a lot of extra effort for you. The instructions are explicit. I have 4 children I was homeschooling at the same time in 4 different grades last semester, and I found this very easy to use, very user-friendly. It does not take a lot of advanced preparation. So some of these resources that are already ready for us to use aren't going to take a lot of extra preparation time to put in place. The next challenge is the home team, supporting the parents. It's a play on words, the home team, right? It's the team at home, and it's the main team for your student and his learning experience. I don't teach my children in their classroom every day, but I still consider myself their primary educator, right? So the home team, it's important to support and encourage. The challenge is whether parents are delegating instruction to teachers, tutors, other helpers, or doing much of it themselves, this work is hard. The temptations to be sad, overwhelmed, frustrated, and lonely are real. Really real some days. But there are potential solutions. I use that word lightly. The real solution is the new heaven and new earth one day, right? But until then, there are some things that you can do to help support and encourage the home team. One of them would be to create a resource library, collect materials, and provide a resource library for parents to check out and use with their children during school, after school, or during the summer. This can include everything from books about different learning challenges to books that address the specific learning challenges. It might be that you want to educate parents more about some of the things you're observing in that detective role, and so we have those kinds of books. Have Simply Classical. Have books like Susan Wise Bauer's Rethinking School that help parents walk through how to figure out what the problem is and how to address it. And then also, if you're able, if your school is able, tuck some of those books in there that they can check out and use at home to address these things. That's a huge asset and encouragement to parents. Also, we can offer workshops and seminars for parents on topics such as classically educating children with dyslexia, anxiety disorder, processing problems, sensory disorder, developmental delays. The list could go on and on and on. Parents without access to specialized services could be equipped to initiate interventions for their own children, minimizing the impact on individual classroom teachers who are struggling to meet every child's needs. So what could your school offer? Are you seeing a lot of families struggling with a certain area? If so, what could be done to kind of present them with some options and let them run with it and motivate them? Support or interest groups based on special needs where parents could find encouraging community where others like them are doing their best to address their child's challenges. I'm interested to hear your feedback on this one when we open it up for discussion. One of the difficult things about parenting a child with learning challenges in the school is privacy regulations. You don't know who else is struggling, right? Unless you just bump into each other and you both have the same book in your hands, you're not going to know who those other families are. Can your schools come up with ways to connect parents and families together in a way that encourages all of them and supports the work of your school at the same time? And lastly, pray for and encourage parents. The work is hard and the days can be long. These students with learning challenges are part of families that are usually made up of several other people. Numerous lives are affected by the difficulties that you're seeing in your classroom and in your school, not just the child that you see every day. Pray for and encourage parents who are working hard to promote their child's success. Sometimes it's difficult to see the forest for the trees. And teaching my own child who has specific learning challenges, I've lost count of how many best days ever are followed by immense, epic struggle 24 hours later. Or how often a concept taught months ago suddenly and inexplicably becomes irretrievable. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and it feels like one to the people who are trying to help. Be the person with the tacky signs, water, and gummy bears at the mile marker. It's a huge encouragement to your parents and to the families of these students. So at this point, and I'm so excited, I left time for discussion because I'm terrible at that. I want to talk so much about this. I'd love to hear from some of you primarily about two questions. One, what is your school doing to help struggling learners that perhaps the rest of us could benefit from hearing? And then two, do you have any other creative strategies to suggest that address any of these four challenges that we have? The challenges of the people, the materials, the time, and the home team. Does anybody have anything to offer? What is your school doing to help struggling students? Anything working?
We have kids who, it seems like it's becoming kind of a bigger issue, who have a lot of sensory issues, and the younger ones. And so what we use actually is called the Zones of Regulation curriculum. I don't know if you guys heard it. It's by, I always forget her name. Her name is Kuipers, Kuypers, Leah M. Kuipers. And she basically talks about how we can help the children to get to a point where they self-regulate. And often, you know, they will act out in a way that distracts, and then as a teacher it's just really hard to manage, and you know, everybody kind of, it's a chaos in the classroom. And so she really has a great visual for little tiny kids starting in preschool, really, all the way to I would say older elementary, where she really teaches them how to self-regulate and just kind of understand what's going on inside of them. You know, when I feel anxious, why is that? What is that? Recognize it and deal with it. And it's really been helpful for our school. And we kind of teach all the teachers, and we all use the same vocabulary, so to speak. So if I say, "Are you in a blue zone?" in 6th grade, the kids already know what that means because they've been taught that, you know, throughout the years. So that's been helpful for us.
Is that something that you've also handed off to parents
Yes.
to learn about?
Yes. They actually, what happens is often the kids, when they're little, they will sort of self-evaluate their state, you know, their emotional state throughout the day. And they fill in these little graphs and they take them home, and then the parents can actually talk to them about, oh, why were you in the red zone here? And so they're aware of it. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was that called again?
It's called the zones of regulation.
Zones of regulation, in case
by
anyone
Leah
didn't hear that.
Kuipers,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. What else is working in your schools? What are some of the challenges? Yeah, go ahead.
This may seem really simple, and I homeschool, but for my son who's slightly dyslexic, he has a fear of even trying new words. And so for him, one of the biggest keys that I did was find books that he loved.
Yeah.
That were easy enough for him to read well, but still fun on his level. And so I just happened, like, it was the Holy Spirit, just happened to have one of these books at home, and he was like, Mom, I love these books. So they're on his level, but they're not babyish. And
Right.
a lot of times it's hard not to find books that seem babyish to those kids who are older, but still struggling. And so we found some, they're called Fly Guy books,
Okay.
and by Ted Arnold. And they're chapter books, but they're very simple chapter books, and they have lots of pictures. And also through the summer, we don't pay for a lot of things at home, like chores. They're part of our family. They just need to do chores. But we pay for reading. And so every book he reads in the summer, we give him a quarter. And that just challenges him and motivates him to want to read because he gets paid for it.
Yeah. I understand the motivation factor, and I will also, what you said reminded me, one of the other reasons that we really like All About Reading is because the readers that come with it are good stories that are kind of fun and interesting, and the stories that they read only have the language that they are supposed to know at that point. That's really hard to find in virtually any reading curriculum. There's always going to be some of those intuitive leaps that you're asking students to make in most if not all classroom reading materials that you might use. And I really appreciate that I can sit down and I have that same experience sometime where my son, I just see it happening physically. Sometimes I have to break out the M&Ms, to get him started. But I can say with confidence when I put these stories in front of him, there is nothing in this story that you don't know how to read. I can say that about this. I can't say that about anything else that he ever reads. And it builds confidence, it's motivating, and it works. It works. I would like to see more regular reading curriculum line up what they have students read more with what's actually been taught so far. Yeah, other?
So we have, my son's dysgraphic, and he could not do a spelling test. And I knew that he could spell the words out loud to me, like perfect. But he went to write them, and he just could not. And so his teacher, we have a Dialed Out Spelling app on the iPad.
We do too.
And so it's so perfect.
It's a great app.
Now he just he does great on all his spelling tests. His teacher lets him use it in class.
Yes.
And so it's really helped a lot.
That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that because we just started spelling. We also use the Apple Pencil and some handwriting. You can import Danielian spelling words. You can import, whatever handwriting your school might be requiring. That's that rabbit trail that we could spend a whole nother hour talking about games and apps and books. But what else would you offer? Yeah.
I teach 7th through 10th grade. So that's actually something I'm about ready to try. So I don't know if anybody else has tried it, but I'm really hoping it'll work. I had a really encouraging conversation with a girl who, I wouldn't say she's on there's no learning disability. It's just that school is always hard.
Yeah.
And so she would work her tail off
Yes.
and get a C.
Yes.
And it's so disheartening for her.
Mm-hmm.
So I had her in 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade.
Yeah.
But it was so disheartening for her. You know, there's 15 to 20 kids in the class, and she can see other kids in her class who were doing half the work,
Mm-hmm.
and they're making twice the grade.
Yes.
And so she had to process all these things, and she's a senior this year, and so I stopped her one day, and I don't have her in class anymore. I said, Mass, I don't have you in class anymore. But I wanted to tell you, I've been so encouraged watching you because I know that you have worked harder than most of the kids who go to school here, and you've never made the same grades that other kids do.
Mm-hmm.
So just tell me about that. What was that like for you? And she just started talking to me how upset. She said, I hate quitting. I won't quit. I can't do it. I'm not going to quit. And I had to be okay with, I know that I studied 3 hours and I made a B- and other kids didn't do that. And I just had to learn to be okay with it. That's not the biggest deal. And I said to her, the thing that is so important to me, and it's amazing, I love hearing you say that, but you're not the only Madison in the school. You're not the only girl who is in 8th grade who's like, I don't understand anything you're teaching in logic class. None of this makes sense. And so, you know, our grades have been due, were due yesterday, and so I got a message her, because I'm going to say to her, I said, Madison, I need you to meet with one of my girls.
Absolutely.
She's not, I don't learning disability or anything, I don't know. It's just nothing is making sense. And
Yeah.
at a certain point you go, well, what am I going to do? Because there's 2 kids in my class and I'm one of them who nothing makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's lonely. It's lonely for the student and it's lonely for the parents. And
Yeah.
I said, hey, can you meet with her? Can you talk with her?
Good idea.
And just walk her through.
Yeah.
You're not the only kid here who's struggling through these classes. And there are things more important in life than your
Yeah.
logic grade in 8th grade. When you're in 8th grade logic, it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah.
But there are more important things. So just trying to connect kids who have worked to overcome just not being very good at school with the
Yeah.
ones who are in the middle of that now and realizing there's bigger things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just, I don't know, it was really encouraging when I had that conversation with the
Yeah.
12th grade girl.
Thanks for
And
having
trying
that
to get her
conversation. Yeah.
to meet with other girls like her.
Right.
So,
I think that's also an example of how you're not just meeting the needs of a student, but that student's contributing to the feel of your whole school community. You know, you've got a really hard worker that's demonstrating to all of her classmates what it looks like to persevere and work hard when you hit challenges. So absolutely, that's excellent. I love to hear that. Any other ideas, suggestions? Yeah.
And this is based on personal experience.
Sure.
Because I homeschooled my kids.
Mm-hmm.
I had a son that really wasn't reading, and it took about 5 years to get him off the ground. I thought, we'll never get off the ground. This is my son, John. And I really thought we were going down the dyslexia route. He just was always struggling. We come to find out he needed glasses.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I was looking for nearsightedness because that runs in the family, but he was farsighted.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was having headaches and just strained that he couldn't communicate to me. We got him glasses, and his reading took off, and it's something he enjoys now. So he was a struggling reader, but it wasn't that specific
That's right.
category I was trying to fix.
Fit him into, yeah,
Right. But we
absolutely.
didn't have the checks of a public school system that says you check your eyes,
Right,
you check
right,
your
right.
ears.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway.
Yeah, that's one of those things I think teacher as detective can help,
Yeah.
parent as observer can help, but also in Rethinking School, Susan Wise Bauer kind of helps you as a parent or a teacher walk through, like, is this a difference? Is it a disability? Is it a disorder? What is this? Here are some things we should just go ahead and check off first, like the vision. Okay, we did that. Okay, he has glasses. Is that helping? Is it taking all of it away? Maybe it's helping a little bit, but it's not the whole picture, and then you just keep going. But yeah, that's not the first time I've ever heard of that happening, for sure. But I do recommend that as a great resource, not just for teachers, but to put in parents' hands to help them try to figure out what some of those challenges are. Yeah.
Interesting when you said about that the student actually helps the whole school environment, that when we as teachers learn how to teach to them, we're actually, like, we're opening up a whole new way of learning for other kids too.
Absolutely.
Making us better teachers, and better parents.
Yeah, there's a quote in Rethinking School. I can't quote it exactly to you, but it's something along the lines of all these things that we're saying maybe we should try or do to meet these challenges of struggling students are not really rocket science, they're just good teaching, right? So a lot of this is just creativity, being observant, being willing to take a risk, being willing to try something new, having enough confidence to say, I'm going to try something. You know, oh, what's the worst that can happen? It fails. You're just where you were, you know. And continuing discussion and dialogue, absolutely. Yeah. Did somebody have their hand up over here?
I think one other thing is I have a son. I have 5 children, and he's a word guesser. He's not a strong reader, and we've done everything in the book. And I just told him, I'm like, look, Trent, this is not what God's got planned for you. You may never be a reader in your life, because God doesn't need you to be able to read. You need to read, but you're going to be a word guesser, and you need to own it. And so instead of him trying to read things that he has no idea that it doesn't even fit in the sentence, like, does that even make sense in your head? Stop guessing, just tell me.
Mm-hmm.
And so he is now 21, and he'll be reading something and go, what's that word? And
Yeah.
I'm like, just own it, because
Being willing to
God's
ask for help. Yeah.
God's created you for something that's going to be magnificent, and it's not going to have to require you to read words that you don't understand, but it does require you to persevere. Own it.
Mm-hmm.
Just say, this is something that I'm not good at. I'm really good at this,
Yes.
but I'm not that good at this, and you need to be able to check your work, because
Mhm.
there's always going to be somebody there. God's going to give you that person to help you.
Mhm.
But in struggling with him, because he has classical school, we homeschooled for a while, and I put him back in school because I just couldn't handle that part. But now as a teacher, teaching, and I teach Latin, 3rd through 6th, and so I see that in other students, but instead of pointing them out in class, I will, you know what, we're all going to do this auditory, and I throw everything in the classroom into that, you know, because I don't want to point out.
Doing it different ways, yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
But I also firmly believe that if they can learn their learning style, Trenton is auditory. And I bought his Apologia science books, and we played it at home after school.
Mhm.
And he would walk around, it's playing in the living room, he's like in the kitchen making food, and I'm like, you are not paying attention. I'm like, you've got to pass your class. And he goes, Mom, I gotta ask me anything.
Yeah.
I'm like, you haven't even been in here.
Doesn't that blow your mind for those of us who aren't that way? It's like, whoa, what?
And so you
Yeah.
ask him, and he has it, and I'm like, yes, sir.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
okay. But I think really trying to teach those kids at an early age of, you recognize, I'm not going to be here, I'm not going to follow you to college.
Mhm.
You need to learn, you know what, I am auditory, I need to record the teacher, I need,
Yeah.
you know, and I think that that's so important to give
Mhm.
our kids the power to
Mhm.
know, so they can do it, and then
Yeah.
teach them how to turn that into something they can use, because
Mhm.
I refuse to follow my own children to wherever they're doing, and, you know, I love my kids, but
Yeah.
it's time for you to
No,
learn
to
how
empower
do
them,
something
give
else.
them agency over their own learning. I think even at a young age, we can teach students how to tell a teacher when they need to slow down, how to ask for help, or if they need more time, or whatever the case may be. We can start very young, and I think that creates and cultivates an attitude in a school community that says these differences aren't less than, they're just differences. Yes, there's a place for we don't broadcast so-and-so's individual learning challenges, but I think there's also a place where why are we covering it all up?
Right.
It's not something to be ashamed of, you know? It's just a difference. And if we really believe what I started with earlier about the formative nature of classical education, of education in essence, then I think we have to change the attitude about all of these other things that fall in line with it. I also wanted to just briefly mention playing to a student's strengths.
Yeah.
So you notice, okay, the auditory memory is excellent with this kid. The force is strong, right? And he can memorize, he can learn that way. All, I think I can say with confidence, of your struggling learners have a strength. They do. Find it. Exploit it. It may not show up right away, especially in those younger kids. You may just feel like in everything they're just working so hard and barely eking by and nothing seems to be taking off. But over time, I think if you stay the course and if parents stay the course, I think you'll start to see, oh my goodness, I had no idea this child could do X. I had no idea they were even gifted in this area over here, which, by the way, academic giftedness can go hand in hand with learning disability, disorder, difference. So be careful not to treat those exclusively. So I think that's really important. It's encouraging for the student, and it also helps you as the teacher, if you can find those strengths, really capitalize on them to help address the weaknesses. I think we're bumping up against closing time here. Does anyone else have comments to offer?
Do you have any suggestions for math?
I was thinking
Yes. I'll be honest and say it's an area I'm diving into right now, so I do not feel like I can speak as an expert. I will say that many math programs are very visually cluttered. If you see those drill pages, how many of you have seen those drill pages? It makes me dizzy looking at them sometimes. Almost any kind of disorder, disability, challenge is going to inhibit a student who looks at a page like that. Some strategies would be covering up part of it, folding it, doing a part of it at a time, cutting it in half and blowing it up so that it's clearly readable, looking for ways to declutter the curriculum. Well-Trained Mind Press has a couple of books that are really good for students, younger students who are not thriving on math fact memory with flashcards and whatever means you're using in the classroom. It teaches the students to figure out how to do the math that they need to know for math facts memory without using the same process that most all math curricula uses that we use in classical schools. I have tried the addition one. I'm trying to think. It's called Addition That Sticks and Subtraction That Sticks, I think, are the ones that they have out now. The Addition That Sticks utilizes a 10 frame with a bold line halfway, and you can use manipulatives to help teach the math facts, and the visual helps. You notice Cheryl Swope mentioning multisensory approach to Latin. That's pervasive in all the Simply Classical, and I think it needs to continue to be in math for those struggling students, maybe beyond what you would think to do with an older student as far as using manipulatives, using alternate ways of approaching math. But those would be my big recommendations. Try a different strategy than the one that's primarily being used, like flashcards for memory, and then making sure it's not visually overwhelming to the student. There are some interesting things about math with struggling students, really like patterns that don't make sense, you know. If any of you have your your head on straight with regards to teaching math to struggling students, maybe I need to talk to you, because it can be a real problem area, even for students who like math, but they're dyslexic or they're, dysgraphic, or they can't write it. They know it's 40, but they're writing 14. They're putting the number the wrong direction. I mean, that's where, as teachers, we want to make sure that we're testing the skill and not hindering and not demotivating, if that's a word, discouraging. If you have a student who's telling you that 30 plus 10 is 14, and you know that student knows that it's 40, just ask them, right? Don't cover their paper in red ink. That's not motivating. I think there are ways we can be flexible with assessment, creative, teaching to multiple intelligences, multiple learning styles that will benefit those students, even in math. Well, let me just close by saying I just want to encourage you all to keep up the good work. Your labor is not in vain. And I don't even mean that in the sense of, one day when we all die and go to heaven, we'll know that we made a difference. No, I think you're going to see it on earth. I think you're going to see it in your students if you utilize some of these tools and learn to fly by the instruments as you're trying to help students in a very disorienting experience of struggling to learn. I can tell you that it is a marathon, it's not a sprint, and it does sometimes take a long time to see improvement. Sometimes we just have to trust the experts a little bit and put something in process and just try it, write it out, see if it works. But you know, I took my son to see his vision doctor a few weeks ago, and we hadn't seen him since before we were out of the country last semester, and I was using Simply Classical and All About Reading and a lot of these resources. And I left very happy because I showed him some of the schoolwork from school here this semester. And he said, oh my goodness, I would have never expected his writing to look like this at this point. And I think you can also, if you read Cheryl Swope's book and her testimony about her children, or if you have ever heard her or watched some of her YouTube videos, her testimony is just the same. Professionals told me my children could never do these things, but a classical education gave them something that other educators and other medical professionals or behavioral specialists couldn't even do. And I think that's because it's not just teaching a skill, it's cultivating a human being. So I just want to leave you with that encouragement that it's a good work, it's a worthy work, and I'm so grateful for all of you and your efforts to address these students' challenges. So thank you.